It was the kind of summer that felt endless. The heat shimmered on the sidewalks, the hum of lawnmowers filled the air, and the scent of barbecues drifted lazily between houses. Maple Drive, a quiet suburban street lined with tidy lawns and blooming hydrangeas, seemed like the perfect place to raise a family. For the narrator, a single parent with two energetic kids, Lily and Maxite, was more than just a neighborhood. It was home. That summer, the kids had come up with an idea. They wanted to start a lemonade stand. Not for profit, not for show, just for fun. They'd been inspired by a picture book about entrepreneurship, and their excitement was contagious. The narrator smiled and decided to let them try it. Together, they spent a weekend building a small wooden stand, painting it bright yellow and scrawling fresh lemonade, 50 inches across the front, in cheerful, uneven letters. The following Saturday, they set up shop at the end of their driveway. The air smelled of citrus and sugar. The ice clinked in the glass jug, and the kids stood proudly behind their little creation, eager to greet their first customer. Neighbors passing by smiled warmly, some stopping to buy a cup. Others offering compliments or dropping a few extra dollars for encouragement. It was wholesome, innocent, and full of the kind of small-town charm that made life feel simple again. But not everyone saw it. That way across the street lived Karen Whitmoran, HOA board member and the self-proclaimed protector of neighborhood standards. She was meticulous about rules, obsessed with order, and seemed to take personal offense at any display of unauthorized activity. Whether it was a slightly mismatched mailbox or a garden gnome placed too close to the curb, Karen had an opinion, and usually it came in the form of a complaint. From her perfectly trimmed hedges, she noticed the lemonade stand almost immediately. Her eyes narrowed as she watched cars stop and children laugh. In her mind, this was not a heartwarming summer scene, it was a violation. The next day, a neatly printed notice appeared in the narrator's mailbox. It was from the HOA. The letter stated that unauthorized commercial activity was prohibited in the neighborhood, and that continued. Operation of the lemonade stand could result in fines. The narrator was taken aback. It seemed absurd that something so innocent could cause such outrage. Still, they didn't want conflict. They told the kids they might need to pause the stand until they figured things out, but the neighborhood had already taken notice. The Wilsons from down the street brought their kids over to buy a final cup before the fun. Police shut it down. The Millers left a note of support, saying their children had run a stand years ago and faced the same pettiness from Karen. Whispers began circulating about how the HOA had become too strict, too cold to JOYLESS. Meanwhile, Karen doubled down. She began documenting every infraction, snapping photos from her driveway, muttering about code violations. The narrator could almost feel her disapproval radiating across the street. And yet, the children's laughter didn't stop. They begged to open the stand again, promising to keep it quiet and clean. So, the next weekend, they set up once more. Only this time, things escalated late that afternoon. As the stand bustled with families and smiling faces, the sound of sirens echoed faintly in the distance. The kids froze. The narrator's heart sank as a police car turned onto Maple Drive, its lights flashing softly in the summer sun. It stopped right in front of their house. Karen stood proudly on her lawn, arms crossed as if she had summoned justice itself. The officers stepped out, confusion clear on their faces as they surveyed the scene. A few children, a lemonade jug, and a line of amused neighbors. They spoke briefly with the narrator, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. It was obvious this was no emergency, but they were obligated to respond. Word spread quickly. Phones came out. Someone recorded the exchange. The absurdity of it, all the fact that police had been called over a lemonade stand, was too much for people to ignore. By the time the sun set, the video was already circulating online. Karen calls cops on kids' lemonade stand became the headline everyone was talking about. The story was shared, mocked, and discussed across social media. Strangers commented in disbelief, while locals rallied in defense of the family. The narrator hadn't planned to start a movement, but sometimes all it takes is one small act of kindness and one big act of pettiness to wake people up. By the end of the week, the situation had outgrown Maple Drive. News vans appeared. Reporters stood on the sidewalk, microphones in hand. The HOA tried to issue a formal statement, calling the matter a misunderstanding, but by then, it was too late. The neighborhood had chosen sides, and for once, Karen wasn't the voice of authority, she was the face of ridicule. But for the narrator, what mattered most wasn't the online buzz or the interviews. It was the look on their children's faces when they asked if they could still sell lemonade. The answer, of course, was yes. They had done nothing wrong. The following weekend, the stand reopened, bigger, brighter, and busier than ever. People from nearby towns drove over just to buy a cup, leaving generous tips and words of encouragement. The little wooden table that started as a fun summer project had turned into a symbol of community defiance. Karen's fury only grew. She sent more complaints, called more meetings, and even hinted at legal action. But this time, the HOA board was hesitant. Too many people were watching, too many voices were speaking up, and though the narrator didn't know it yet, the battle was far from over. The war between one family's simple joy and one woman's need for control was only beginning. The next chapter would take it from the sidewalks of Maple Drive straight into the courtroom. The viral video had turned a quiet suburban dispute into a full-blown community spectacle. What started as a harmless lemonade stand had now become the talk of the town and far beyond it. For the narrator and their children, it was surreal. They hadn't asked for attention. They had only wanted to make memories, to teach the kids about hard work and a bit of independence. But now, their driveway had become a symbol of resistance against pettiness and control. Within a week, reporters were still circling Maple Drive, interviewing neighbors, filming B-roll footage of the yellow lemonade stand, and asking about the neighborhood Karen. Some residents avoided the spotlight. Others embraced it. Most, however, rallied around the family, bringing supplies, snacks, and even small gifts for the kids. They wanted to show support, to remind the family that they weren't alone. But Karen Whitmore, the self-appointed enforcer of neighborhood order, couldn't stand it. Every smiling customer, every news van, every shared post online only, deepened the crack in her composure. She had lived in Maple Drive for nearly 20 years, serving on the HOA board for 15 of them. She was used to people respecting her, or at least fearing her authority. Now, she was a meme. Her name was trending locally, and worse, her image caught, scowling in the background of the viral video, had become the internet's favorite symbol of misplaced outrage. That was intolerable. The HOA board called an emergency meeting. Though the narrator wasn't invited, word quickly spread about the tense discussions that took place. Some board members wanted to let the matter drop. Others, mostly Karen's allies, wanted to restore order. They claimed the lemonade stand brought unwanted attention, traffic, and violated community bylaws. But the real issue wasn't lemonade or traffic, it was pride. Karen's pride. A week later, the narrator received another official letter hand-delivered by an HOA officer. It stated that the family was in violation of multiple rules, approving a business without HOA approval, creating a public nuisance, and damaging the aesthetic consistency of the neighborhood. The fines had doubled. If they didn't shut down the stand immediately, further action could be taken. It wasn't just frustrating, it was exhausting. The narrator felt trapped between maintaining peace and defending something that shouldn't even need defending. Every time they looked at their children's hopeful faces, they knew they couldn't give in. The lemonade stand wasn't about money anymore, it was about fairness, about principle, so they reached out for help. One of the local news anchors, who had covered the story earlier, recommended contacting a pro bono attorney who specialized in HOA overreach. The lawyer, intrigued by the absurdity of the case, agreed to take it. He believed they had a solid defense. The kid stand wasn't a registered business, it was a temporary charitable neighborhood activity. No sales permit was required, and the HOA's bylaws didn't apply in this context. While preparations began, the situation in the neighborhood intensified. Karen began going door to door, collecting signatures for a petition to reinforce HOA control. But instead of support, she found resistance. Neighbors politely refused to sign, some even closing their doors in her face. The tide had turned. The kids, oblivious to the deeper politics, continued to run their stand. Each day brought new customers, people who had seen their story online or heard it on local radio. They came to show solidarity, not just to buy lemonade. Homemade banners appeared around the block. Let the kids pour, and squeeze the rules, not the lemons. But Karen was relentless. One morning, as the family prepared for another day at the stand, they noticed a notice pinned to their front door. It was an HOA summons and order to attend a disciplinary hearing. The HOA claimed the stand had become a public disturbance, citing increased traffic, noise, and potential hazards. It was clear that Karen had found a new way to escalate the fight, the narrator sighed, knowing this wouldn't end quietly. The lawyer assured them that the HOA had overstepped and that their hearing had no legal teeth. Still, the family decided to attend, hoping to clear things up once and for all. The community center was packed that evening. Neighbors, journalists, and even local council members had come to watch. The tension in the room was thick. At the front sat Karen, perfectly poised, flanked by two HOA members who looked less confident by the minute. She read through her complaints as if conducting an official trial, speaking about order, community image, and rules. When it was the narrator's turn to respond, they spoke calmly but firmly. They explained how the lemonade stand had brought people together, how it had revived the sense of neighborliness that Maple Drive had lost. They mentioned the donations that had come and how the kids were now using the money to buy school supplies for local children. The crowd murmured approvingly. Karen's composure cracked. She tried to interject, but the tide had turned again. Even some board members shifted uncomfortably, realizing they were on the wrong side of the story. The hearing ended without resolution. Karen stormed out, muttering under her breath about legal action. The lawyer smiled knowingly, predicting exactly what would come next. She would file an official complaint not through the HOA, but through small claims court, and she did. A week later, a formal notice arrived. Karen Whitmore v. the Johnson family. She was suing the narrator for unauthorized commercial activity and creating community distress. It seemed ridiculous, even laughable, but it was also serious. The case was real. And while the narrator's lawyer was confident, court meant time, energy, and exposure. For Karen, this was a final attempt to reclaim control. For the family, it was a chance to make a statement, not just for themselves, but for every family who'd ever been bullied by someone hiding behind the word rules. The day before the hearing, the neighborhood was quiet. The lemonade stand sat folded in the garage, its bright yellow paint dulled by dust. The kids asked when they could reopen it, but their parent didn't have an answer not yet. Tomorrow would decide everything as the sun set. The narrator stood by the window, looking at the empty spot at the end of the driveway where the stand once stood. It wasn't just about lemonade anymore. It was about standing up to unnecessary authority, about teaching their children the difference between rules and righteousness. The courtroom awaited. The morning of the court hearing arrived with an uneasy stillness. The neighborhood, once buzzing with activity and chatter, seemed to hold its breath. For weeks, everyone on Maple Drive had followed the escalating feud first, the lemonade stand, then the HOA letters, and finally, Karen's lawsuit. Now, it was time for the ultimate showdown. Karen Whitmore versus the Johnson family. In the small-town courthouse just a few miles away, the narrator woke before dawn, nerves humming like an electric current. The kids were still asleep, their lemonade sign propped against the wall. A bittersweet reminder of how everything had started just two children, a few lemons, and a simple dream. Now, it had spiraled into something far bigger, a community's reckoning with control, pride, and fairness. By 9 a.m., the courthouse parking lot was half full. Local reporters had set up their cameras outside, hoping to catch a glimpse of the now infamous HOA Karen. A few neighbors had shown up too, offering quiet nods of support. Some even brought homemade signs that read "Justice for the Lemon Kids" and "Let them sell in peace." Karen arrived fashionably late, stepping out of her silver SUV with a clipboard in hand and an expression of superiority that looked rehearsed. Her lawyer, a sharply dressed man with slicked-back hair, followed closely behind. Karen moved with confidence. After all, she believed she was in the right. To her, this wasn't about children or lemonade. It was about authority, about proving that the rules mattered and that her interpretation of them should never be questioned. Inside, the courtroom was small, but packed. The narrator sat quietly beside their attorney, trying to stay calm. The lawyer whispered reassurances, flipping through papers with the ease of someone who'd handled HOA disputes many times before. Across the aisle, Karen sat stiffly, her eyes darting toward the judge's bench every few seconds. She wore a pastel blazer and a smug half-smile that said she already expected to win. When the judge entered, a woman in her late 50s with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor, the room fell silent. After brief introductions, the judge glanced down at the file in front of her and sighed audibly. "This is quite a case," she said, her tone neutral but tinged with disbelief. Karen's lawyer stood first, launching into a long, self-important speech about community standards, neighborhood governance, and unauthorized commercial operations. He presented photos of the lemonade stand, screenshots from social media, and even a printout of the HOA bylaws. His argument was that the Johnsons had operated a business without approval, bringing unwanted attention and disruption to the neighborhood. The judge listened patiently but asked few questions. She'd seen countless petty disputes before. But something about this one, about the lengths to which Karen had gone, seemed different. When the lawyer finished, she turned her gaze to the defense table. The narrator's attorney stood slowly, his tone measured but firm. He explained how the lemonade stand had been a simple, temporary activity run by two children for fun. There had been no profit motive, no traffic jams, no damage. He pointed out that no HOA bylaw explicitly prohibited such activities, and even if it did, the HOA had no jurisdiction to enforce fines for non-commercial family-related events. Then he did something unexpected. He presented a folder filled with letters, dozens of them from neighbors, local business owners, and community members who supported the family. Each letter spoke of how the lemonade stand had brought people together, revived a sense of neighborliness, and inspired kindness in a community that had grown too rigid under the weight of rules and appearances. As the letters were read aloud, something shifted in the courtroom. People who had come just to watch now leaned forward, listening closely. The judge's expression softened. Karen, for the first time, looked uncertain. When it was time for the judge's questions, she didn't focus on the paperwork or legal jargon. Instead, she turned to Karen directly. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, her voice steady, "help me understand something. You filed a lawsuit over a children's lemonade stand." Karen straightened in her chair. "Yes, Your Honor. It was against HOA rules. We can't allow exceptions. That's how chaos begins." The judge tilted her head, almost smiling. "Chaos from lemonade." A ripple of quiet laughter spread through the courtroom. Karen's lawyer tried to interject, but the judge held up a hand. "Mrs. Whitmore, the land, common sense both, allow for reason. These are children. They weren't running a commercial enterprise. They were selling lemonade. Do you understand how this looks?" Karen's face turned a deep shade of red. She opened her mouth to respond, but couldn't find the words. The judge continued. "This court will not be weaponized for personal vendettas or inflated egos. The HOA's job is to foster community, not to punish it. And frankly, I find this entire situation absurd." The room broke into quiet applause before the judge called for order. She then turned to the narrator and their attorney. "Case dismissed," she said simply. "No fines, no penalties. And I'd suggest the HOA focus on real issues moving forward." Karen looked crushed. Her lawyer whispered something, but she ignored him. As the judge left the bench, the crowd began murmuring with relief and satisfaction. The narrator exhaled deeply for the first time in weeks, the tension finally breaking. The kid's simple dream had become a symbol of community triumph. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed, microphones appeared, and questions poured in. But this time, the story wasn't about conflict. It was about victory. The town had chosen empathy over ego, fairness over fear. That night, the lemonade stand returned to its place at the end of the driveway. Neighbors gathered again, laughing, talking, and raising cups of lemonade in celebration. It wasn't just a stand anymore. It was a monument to perseverance and unity. And yet, even as the laughter filled the warm evening air, the narrator couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to back down quietly. Somewhere behind those tightly drawn curtains on Maple Drive, she was already planning her next move. After her public humiliation in court, Karen Whitmore's perfectly curated world began to crack. The woman who once walked through the neighborhood with unshakable authority now felt the sting of whispered laughter behind every manicured hedge. For years, she had been the self-appointed guardian of Maple Drive standards. But now, after the judge's verdict, those very neighbors she had ruled over looked at her not with respect, but with quiet amusement. That humiliation was unbearable. losing in front of the entire town, being laughed at on local news, and watching a family she'd tried to ruin become neighborhood heroes. It gnawed at her pride every waking moment. She avoided the park, stopped attending HOA gatherings, and even changed her morning walk schedule to avoid seeing the Johnsons' cheerful lemonade stand. Yet, no matter how much she tried to disappear, the sound of laughter from that stand haunted her. Every cup of lemonade sold was a reminder of her failure. Every smile from the kids was salt in an open wound. That's when Karen decided she wouldn't be defeated so easily. If she couldn't win in court, she would win in the shadows. She began to plot carefully, methodically, a plan to reclaim control and restore her authority. She started by rallying her few remaining loyalists. Within the HOA, there were always those who disliked seeing others happy, people who grumbled about noise or property values at every meeting. Karen fed them a story about lawlessness and disrespect for community order. She painted the Johnsons as rebels, undermining the fabric of Maple Drive. She began to rebuild her power. Her first move came in the form of new HOA proposals. Under the guise of community safety, she introduced new bylaws that restricted all front yard activities. Yard sales, bake sales, charity drives, everything required written HOA approval. Though some board members were hesitant, Karen's persistence wore them down. She spoke of liability, order, and protecting neighborhood aesthetics. And when her proposals passed by a slim margin, she smiled for the first time in months. The Johnsons received a new rule book in their mailbox, 50 pages of fine print filled with impossible conditions. It was clearly targeted at them. While it didn't mention lemonade stands directly, the wording was unmistakable. The narrator sighed as they flipped through the pages. The cheerful little business their kids had built was once again under threat. This time through paperwork and red tape. Karen wasn't done. She filed noise complaints with the city, alleging disturbance from the crowds gathering near the stand. She sent anonymous letters to local zoning offices, claiming the Johnsons were running an unlicensed operation, even though none of these claims held merit. Each required time and energy to address. Weeks passed, and the harassment continued. The narrator's family tried to stay strong, reminding themselves of the community's support. Neighbors continued to stop by, leaving generous tips and kind words. But the tension was growing. It was no longer just about lemonade. It was about standing up to a system that refused to let ordinary people live freely. Karen watched from her window, notebook in hand, documenting every delivery truck, every new customer, every small detail she could twist into a complaint. The glow of her laptop became her only companion as she drafted emails late into the night to city inspectors, to anyone who would listen. She didn't realize it yet, but her obsession was consuming her. Her friends began to distance themselves. Even her allies in the HOA started to question her motives. What began as a crusade for rules and order was turning into a personal vendetta that exposed her insecurities for all to see. Then came the day of reckoning. A week later, an official letter arrived, not from the HOA, but from the county's environmental department. It stated that Karen herself was under investigation for unauthorized pesticide use. Apparently, during one of her previous HOA landscaping projects, she had ordered unapproved chemicals to be used on the community flat. The whistleblower, an anonymous tip, one that included photos, timestamps, and receipts. The irony was poetic. Karen stormed into the next HOA meeting, demanding to know who had framed her. But by then, her influence had crumbled. The board, embarrassed by her behavior, voted to suspend her from all leadership roles pending the investigation. The community she had once ruled now avoided her entirely. Meanwhile, the Johnsons continued running their stand, now bigger and more joyful than ever. A local cafe even partnered with them, turning their recipe into a signature drink called Lemon Justice. The profits went to local children's charities, something that made the story spread even further online, as the Johnsons watched their kids serve another line of smiling customers. They realized something powerful. Karen had never been the real threat. It was fear of standing up, fear of breaking the mold that truly held people back. Once the community saw through that, Karen's power vanished. But still, in her dimly lit living room, Karen refused to accept defeat. She stared out the window at the golden light, reflecting off the lemonade stand sign. Her reflection glared back at her, bitter, isolated, and vengeful. In her mind, this wasn't over. Not yet, she would find another way. She always did. After weeks of Karen's relentless scheming, Maple Drive had grown weary of her drama. What once was a quiet, friendly suburban street now buzzed with quiet rebellion. The people had seen enough. They were tired of being bullied by one woman hiding behind the letters HOA. The story of the lemonade stand had spread far beyond their little town. Local newspapers had run follow-up articles, framing it as a battle between ordinary families and overzealous neighborhood power. Parents from neighboring towns drove over just to buy a cup, take photos, and show their support. What started as a small protest had grown into a movement, a symbol of standing up to unnecessary control. The Johnson family had never asked for fame, but their small act of defiance inspired others. One house down the street set up a bake stand, another hosted a weekend yard art display. Every few days, someone else would start a new stand. Cookies, crafts, lemonade, even free library boxes. Maple Drive had turned into a lane of creativity and kindness, and Karen hated every moment of it. From her window, she watched in disgust as the quiet order she once enforced fell apart. Children laughing, cars parking on the curb, chalk art decorating the sidewalks, all of it felt like chaos to her. She wrote emails, filed complaints, even called the police again. But this time, no one took her seriously. The authorities were tired of her name showing up in every complaint log. Officers began responding to her calls with visible irritation, sometimes taking their time to even show up. Word had spread internally. Karen Whitmore was a nuisance caller. The town council, meanwhile, decided to step in. A meeting was scheduled to discuss community harmony after multiple baseless complaints. It wasn't officially about Karen, but everyone knew who it was for. That night, the community hall was packed. Residents from all over Maple Drive filled the rows, their faces determined. Parents held signs reading, "Let kids be kids," and lemonade, not litigation. Even local business owners showed up to voice their frustration over the HOA's restrictive policies. The Johnsons sat quietly near the back, not eager for attention, but touched by the overwhelming support. Karen marched up to the microphone, posture rigid, expression sharp. She spoke about neighborhood integrity, rules, and decline of property standards. But this time, her words fell flat. One by one, people stood up to challenge her. A mother spoke about how her kids had made friends at the lemonade stand. A retired teacher talked about how community spaces built stronger families. A teenager proudly said that the stand had inspired her to start a small business of her own. Karen tried to interrupt, but the moderator silenced her with a stern look. The crowd wasn't with her anymore, and she knew it. Then, unexpectedly, the mayor stood and took the microphone. He thanked the Johnson family for reminding everyone what community meant. He proposed an official neighborhood spirit day, encouraging families to run small stands, share homemade goods, and build connections. The entire hall erupted in applause. Karen sat frozen in that single moment. The power she had clung to for years dissolved into nothing. Every pair of eyes that once looked to her for approval now looked past her. She was no longer the voice of Maple Drive. She was the echo of its past. The mayor announced that the HOA's bylaws would be reviewed by a special committee to ensure fairness and to prevent misuse of authority. That phrase hit Karen like a thunderclap. It wasn't just about lemonade anymore. It was a referendum on her reign. The next few weeks brought more changes than she could handle. The HOA, now led by a new interim president, revoked several of Karen's restrictive rules. Residents were allowed to host small community activities without approval. The oppressive appearance standards were relaxed. For the first time, Maple Drive felt alive. Local media returned to cover the story again, this time highlighting the town's transformation. Cameras captured scenes of laughter, neighbors sharing food, and kids waving handmade signs that said "Lemonade wins." Karen, however, vanished from public view. Her manicured front yard, once a symbol of control, grew dull. The flowers wilted from neglect, the hedges lost their perfect shape. She no longer attended meetings. Occasionally, people spotted her staring blankly from her window, watching the children play where she once demanded silence. But her downfall wasn't just personal. The HOA board, embarrassed by her actions, issued a formal apology to the Johnson family. They even awarded the kids a small community appreciation plaque for fostering unity and kindness. It was a poetic The moment the children she tried to silence were now honored by the very institution she had once ruled. The Johnsons accepted it humbly, thanking the town for their support. They didn't gloat or mention Karen's name. They didn't need to. Everyone already knew. As summer deepened, the lemonade stand became a tradition. Every weekend, families gathered there, chatting, laughing, and sharing stories. The Johnson kids added new flavors: strawberry, mint, even a Karen citrus special that everyone chuckled about but loved to drink. The proceeds went toward building a small community. Playground, another idea that came from the lemonade crowd. Volunteers helped with supplies. The city approved the plan, and soon, construction began. The once quiet, tightly controlled Maple Drive had become a symbol of unity and freedom. But even in victory, the Johnson family remained humble. They knew it wasn't about revenge, it was about setting things right as they watched the new playground take shape. They couldn't help but smile. What started as a small act of innocence had grown into something much bigger, a legacy of togetherness that even the most stubborn heart couldn't destroy. And yet, somewhere down the street, behind a closed curtain, Karen still sat in her darkened living room, staring at her reflection in the window. Wondering how everything had slipped through her fingers? She didn't realize it yet. But the story wasn't just about her downfall. It was about what the town had gained because of it. The summer sun of Maple Drive burned golden that year, glinting off freshly painted fences, kids' bicycles, and a brand new playground that now stood proudly at the end of the street. The laughter of children echoed through the neighborhood, laughter that, not long ago, had been silenced by rules, fines, and fear. The Johnson family's lemonade stand had grown beyond its humble beginnings. What started as a simple act of defiance against unfairness had become the heart of the community. Every weekend, families gathered there. It wasn't just about lemonade anymore. It was about connection, belonging, and freedom. People brought homemade cookies, others donated fresh fruit, and local musicians played for free. The neighborhood that once followed Karen's every rule, like soldiers now, followed a much simpler one: kindness. John often stood behind the stand, watching his kids smile as they poured cups for their friends, their faces glowing in the sunlight. He couldn't help but feel proud, not of the victory over Karen, but of what that fight had created. A place where his children could grow without fear, where people helped each other. Instead of reporting each other, the town's transformation didn't stop there. Inspired by Maple Drive, nearby neighborhoods began to loosen their HOA restrictions. The story had become a local legend, one that spread on social media, covered by reporters, and even turned into a short segment on morning news shows. The lemonade stand that changed a town. The headline read, "Soon, letters and emails started arriving at the Johnsons' home from families across the country. Parents shared stories of their own run-ins with unreasonable HOA boards. Kids sent drawings of lemonade stands, and strangers thanked them for showing that standing up, even in small ways, mattered. The Johnsons framed some of those letters and hung them by the kitchen door. Every time they passed by, it reminded them that courage could be contagious. Meanwhile, Karen's world had shrunk to the four walls of her once pristine home. The same home that had been her fortress of control now felt like a cage of her own making. Her name had become a cautionary tale, the woman who called the cops on kids and lost everything. Her friends from the HOA board avoided her, embarrassed by association. Her picture had even circulated online with sarcastic captions like the lemonade law enforcer. The internet had a way of immortalizing mistakes, and Karen's had gone viral. Weeks turned into months, and she stopped showing up at meetings altogether. The HOA had quietly voted to remove her from all positions of authority. Her reign of petty rules and fines was over. But Maple Drive didn't celebrate her downfall. It simply moved on. The best revenge wasn't humiliation. It was happiness. On the first anniversary of the lemonade stand, the neighborhood decided to celebrate. The new HOA board declared it Lemonade Day, an official local event where every family could set up their own stands or displays, all proceeds going to community improvements. The morning of the event was filled with color. Balloons lined the street, hand-painted signs waved gently in the breeze, and kids wore bright yellow shirts with lemon prints. Cars lined up along the curb, families from nearby towns walking from stand to stand, trying different drinks and snacks. The Johnson stand was still the centerpiece. Its sign, freshly painted with the words, "When life gives you Karens, make lemonade." Even the mayor attended, smiling as he shook hands and praised the community for turning conflict into unity. Local news cameras rolled again, capturing the sight of neighbors laughing, music playing, and cups clinking in toasts to better days. For John, it was surreal. He remembered the fear and frustration of that first day when police had arrived at his door because of a lemonade stand. And now, here they were, a symbol of positivity and resilience, celebrated by everyone around them. But amid the crowd, something unexpected happened. Across the street, at the edge of the park, stood Karen. She had come quietly. Uninvited, her expression unreadable, she wasn't dressed like her old self. No formal blazer, no clipboard, no sharp expression of judgment, just a simple summer dress and a hesitant look in her eyes. For a long moment, she just watched. The laughter, the joy, the lemonade being poured, the same things she had once despised. Some neighbors noticed her and whispered, unsure how to react, but no one approached her, and she didn't speak. She simply stood there, hands clasped, eyes glimmering faintly with something that might have been regret. Then, one of the Johnson kids, Emma, spotted her. Without hesitation, the little girl ran back to the stand, filled a cup of lemonade, and walked across the street. The crowd fell silent as Emma handed the cup to Karen. The woman hesitated, looking down at the drink, then at the child's innocent smile. Slowly, she took it. For the first time in a long while, Karen smiled back, a small, tired smile, but genuine. She took a sip, nodded slightly, and then walked away, disappearing behind the line of parked cars. No one said a word, but everyone knew what they had just witnessed. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. It was something quieter, deeper, a kind of peace. That evening, as the sun set behind the rooftops and the golden light reflected off the rows of lemonade cups, John sat on his porch, listening to the sounds of laughter fading into the warm summer air. He felt a sense of completeness, as if the circle had finally closed. The fight, the tension, the embarrassment, the legal battles, all of it had led to this moment. The lemonade stand had started as a lesson for his kids, about standing up for what's right. But it had become a lesson for the whole town about unity, kindness, and the quiet power of community. Months later, the story was featured in a small documentary about small-town America. It ended with a shot of the Johnsons' front yard, a sign now permanently fixed to the fence, "The Lemon Legacy," where it all began. Beneath it, a short inscription read, "Sometimes the sweetest victories come from the sourest lemons." And so, Maple Drive carried on stronger, kinder, and a little more human than before. The lemonade stand still opened every summer. The kids had grown, but the spirit of that first day never faded. People still came by, smiled, and said, "This is the street where it all happened." And every time someone took a sip of that simple, sweet lemonade, they tasted more than sugar and lemons. They tasted what happens when ordinary people choose courage over fear.